All right, we're good to go. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I am joined by three other lovely people. We have Jess Owens from the channel of the same name. We have Jessie May, also from the channel of the same name. And then Brandon Sanderson, who technically also has a channel of the same name. But I'm pretty sure most people that are watching this aren't going to think like, oh, that Sanderson guy seemed pretty cool. I'm going to check him out.
Famous Instagrammer, Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah.
What goes to their head.
So, we, of course, are all big fans of your works, but you have Cytonic coming out soon. So we definitely have a lot of questions involved with the Skyward series. And to kind of kick it off, I wanted to ask, because I think something a lot of people appreciate about your works is how well you're able to take something that's very familiar to science fiction fantasy fans and then kind of ask, well, what if this trope was actually like this? Or what if this character was actually like this? So with Skyward, it kind of started as the boy and his dragon changed to the girl and her spaceship. So how do you balance between something familiar and then still manage to make it unique?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there is this push and pull, right, as a writer between the familiar and the strange. That's how we talk about it. And every book is going to have some familiar, every book is going to have some strange, and every genre has different conventions for that, right? If you go to a cozy mystery, you generally want more familiar. You just want the strange to be that you have to figure out a new mystery. And in the books that I write, I am always juggling this. And I say to my students, one of the difficult things is narrative plot is one of those things that it's difficult to be too strange about, because, well, it's easy to be strange, except if you do it, you just aren't foreshadowing, you aren't following a plot structure. You can surprise people in an unsatisfying way very easily. Surprising people in a satisfying way is more difficult. And so having a plot structure that then you're playing with, that your readership may be able to kind of pick up on even unconsciously, allows you to actually surprise people better, because they start to know what to expect, and so they can start to anticipate what's going to happen. One of the fun things that happens in child development is when they start to be able to anticipate what movies or television shows they're watching are going to do. And learning that, like each of my kids have reached that point where they're like, oh, wait, this is where things get bad. And then they get good again. And in the movies they watch, that always happens, right? And so with Skyward, one of the things holding me back from writing The Boy and His Dragon, right, was that I didn't feel like I was adding anything to it. But for me, a lot of what I wanted to add was setting and character. Can I do something new and interesting? Often when I'm writing YA, I'm looking for an interesting voice. Can I write an interesting voice? Can I add something to this setting? And it was a couple of elements. It was Spensa's voice that really clicked with me. And it was this idea that people are hyperdrives. People facilitate moving around the universe from planet to planet, and kind of that burden that it puts on the person. Really, those two elements clicked with me really well. And then the mysterious space force that you're fighting against, you don't know who they are, like a good mystery like that. These things just all mix together for me. And then that framework of, here's the general story beats that I probably want to try to hit. And I know how these story beats work and why they're successful. Gives me just a skeleton to start hanging my book on.
Have you scrapped anything because you didn't feel like it was unique enough, or are you usually able to turn it into what you're hoping to turn it into?
I have occasionally scrapped things. Usually they don't make it out of the outline stage. It's been a while since I scrapped something because it felt too generic. It did happen one book in my unpublished years, right before I sold. I wrote 13 novels before I published, and number 9 was the one I scrapped for just feeling too much like a generic epic fantasy. Every other book that I've scrapped, it's been other issues. The most recent one I scrapped, it was character issues. And I just could not get the character down. And plus, the world building was a little weak. And that's just not something that I think I can let slide. But I scrapped that one. That was 4 or 5 years ago. I haven't had to scrap one that I actually had finished since then. Like I usually catch them in the outline stage and say, no, that's just been done to death.
I wonder if we were to see it, if we still think it was fantastic, though. It's just yours.
Probably.
Maybe. I don't know. I like to think that the quality control that I put on things is part of why people enjoy my books and can feel comfortable picking up a YA science fiction or, an adult epic fantasy and know they're going to have a good time. But who knows? It could just be the artist mentality, right?
Yeah, always kind of second guessing. I think it's just unusual for so many of us who are such big fans we all hear our favorite authors. They're people too and that kind of thing, but it's hard to imagine that you might still have those thoughts. You mentioned Spensa a little bit and really liking her voice. I know we have 2 Jesses here. We have a Jess E and then a Jess, but I know Jess had a question about Spensa.
Yeah, I love Spensa. I think we've talked about her, and her voice is very distinct. But I know in a previous interview you talked about kind of putting a little bit of yourself in every character. So I was wondering what do you and Spensa have in common, or like what did you write into her character that's a part of you?
Yeah. So the chunk of me that is Spensa is this idea of of story being such a part of her past and her personal narrative, right? Like we all create personal narratives for ourselves. And they all have their toes dipped in truth. Or maybe their whole body dipped in truth up to the ankle, depending on the story. But they are still narratives we construct. Like one of mine is this idea that the 13 novels I wrote. I did write 13 novels before I published, but that became part of my kind of foundational myth. And the stories that I read, particularly when I was 14 to 16, are just foundational to how I see storytelling. And I keep, relying back on those. I mean, one of my favorite books from that period was The White Dragon by Anne McCaffrey, which is a boy and his dragon story, right? Which is Skyward's kind of in the direct lineage of that, so to speak. This idea of clinging to the stories of the past and trying to see how they shape our future was a big part of me in her narrative.
Do you ever find yourself narrating your own life?
I do. And my brain always says, maybe, autobiography. And I'm like, nah, I don't have time for an autobiography. Too many stories that are more interesting.
I saw a comedian say that everybody thinks they're the man on fire. Everybody imagines themselves as that action hero, but really you're the person that's opening the door for Denzel Washington.
Yeah, I'm opening the door for a whole bunch of characters to come storming through.
I know Jesse. I won't mention Jess or Jesse for each of the questions here moving forward. I know it gets a little confusing, but because you talked about how you have the different projects, I know you get questions about this. You hop around.
Yeah, my question is with Skyward and something like Stormlight that I know you're kind of working on simultaneously or alternating between those releases. How are you able to switch when you're working on each of those different things, especially since they are targeted towards different age ranges?
So one thing that helps me a ton is I have done my YA books in first person. This isn't, there are plenty of excellent third person YA novels. But first person is a little more intimate. You see it more often in YA than you do in adult. And a lot of my favorite YAs, particularly in recent years, are doing a first person. And so what this does is it gives me this sort of a different mindset to get into, a voice to switch to, and that sort of harder line between the two is really helpful for me when I'm switching back and forth. The thing about YA is it's so hard to even define what makes YA and what doesn't, right? It's one of these, like, what makes a thing YA?
We actually had a question exactly on that I was also going to ask. So we can just get right into that.
Yeah. So you've got the question, is it a marketing tool? I think it absolutely is. Mm-hmm. All genres are marketing tools. And tools that we can use as readers to help find similar books, right? There's just too many books out there. We can't even read all the ones that we would probably love to read. And so having tools to let us find something when we say, I really liked this. I feel like something similar to this. Can I get something like this? Books are so weird in that, we've talked about it before. If you like a certain flavor of ice cream, you can just go get that flavor of ice cream. But for books, particularly, with a new one you haven't read before, you want a flavor that gives you the same joy of the previous flavor you've had, but doesn't actually taste like that flavor, at least not entirely. And so we need these tools to be able to find similar things. And what makes YA to me? Well, YA to me usually has to do with a couple of with the themes, right? YA usually leans into search for identity. Not all YAs have to do this, but that's a big one. Things like that. Search for those kind of foundational stories that are going to make up who you are. Whereas a lot of adult is, I have this narrative, but my narrative is shifting. I'm becoming somebody else. Or I always thought I was this narrative, but I'm not. Or here is my narrative. How does that apply to my current experiences and whatnot? Where the quest for that narrative tends to be a big theme. Like, who am I? This is a huge theme of Skyward, right? Like, Spensa, the first book, has always seen herself. She's like, I'm going to be a courageous warrior, right? And then she goes into battle and she has to be like, what does that even mean anymore? What is my narrative once I'm actually a soldier? Because everything changes. And that feels just very YA to me. YA generally as a genre, you want to waste less time, and you want your narrative to abandon a lot of the pretense and just get to the story. Is kind of been my experience with YA, but I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, the easy answer is, it's about kids who are 19 and under. But the Golden Compass is such an interesting example of nobody knows where to shelve that book, so they just print 3 editions and put it everywhere. So yeah.
And you have Mistborn now in both YA and adult. Do you have any say in that?
What's that? I asked them to do that. Yeah.
You asked them to do that?
Yeah. So I've got a fun story here. So as a teen, I'd gotten into epic fantasy, right? And I did volunteer work at a library because I thought, I like books now. Let's go to a library. And as a senior in my school, you were asked to do some service for the community. To get your honors or whatever. But anyway, I went to a library and became a shelf reader. I don't know if you know what shelf reading is, but it's where you go on the shelves and find all the books that are out of order and pull them out so they can be put in order. And I was shelf reading in children's. And I found Anne McCaffrey there. And I went to the head librarian. I said, Anne McCaffrey's not a children's book. I'm a big boy. I read adult books. Right. I was offended, and the librarian very wisely said, I put the books where the people who are going to love them can find them. And some teens prefer to browse in children's because it makes them more comfortable and more familiar. Mm-hmm. So she actually shelved Anne McCaffrey in both places. And I've always remembered that. Put the books like where the people who will love them will find them. And I actually really like that YA became a more prevalent thing. As I understand, like, librarians were already making YA sections long before my library had one. But for me, once I started to see the YA genre become a thing, I got very excited. I started to see it in the late 90s. I'm like, this is a really good thing, right? Because those teens that were like me, they're like, I'm a big boy. We'll have a section they can move to, and things like that. So I went to Tor and I said, hey, I'd really like there to be a YA edition of Mistborn. I think that's where people who will love Mistborn, some of them are browsing. And so let's try to get the book there for them.
I think that's really true. I have seen booksellers mention that same thing, that they know, oh, I know that book is adult, but I'm putting it over here for readers that I think will be interested in it. Do you have an opinion on people who get upset when they see things as YA? Because I've seen a friend of mine mentioned she thought Wheel of Time was a story that you can start reading because a lot of people grew up reading Wheel of Time as it was coming out. And she said that she thinks it makes sense for YA readers to read it. And a lot of people got upset about that.
Really?
A lot of people got upset
Or
about
did
it.
YA editions of the Wheel of Time.
Yeah,
So, they did split them. It was kind of a failed experiment because Wheel of Time's so big. They're like, this is too intimidating for the YA section. So they split like the books into 2 or 3. And it was, I think, a failed experiment for that reason. Because then the kids are like, oh, it's only 1/3 of a story. No, I don't. I learned my lesson as a teen, that one of the things that really bothers me is this sort of sense we have that certain genres are more worthy than other genres, and certain types of stories are more worthy than other types of stories. And it really plays out as kind of ageism against the young. You see anything that a teen or a tween is into suddenly becomes a pariah in the community. And it really bothers me. It's like, our teens less people because they, their interests, they if they like something, why do we anyway? It bothers me. It really bothers me when people look down at YA. And I think it comes from the fact that, I'm in science fiction. We are we have spent our life fighting against the literary fiction folks. And some of that is how shall I say, like the mystery people and the romance people, they don't care. They don't care what the literary people say. They go and do their own thing. They're like, whatever. They're gonna go sip their champagne and pretend to be posh. We're just gonna have fun and enjoy our stories. But sci-fi fantasy lives in this world where a lot of our greats have one foot in the literary fiction realm. Your Ursula Le Guin's, your Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood, even things like 1984, or going back, to The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream, right? Like a lot of sci-fi fantasy is straddling all these lines between all different types of genres. You end up with things like Sword of Shannara, which is like, this would have been published as YA if YA were a thing, but it was published as adult at the time, and sci-fi fantasy is this weird box that doesn't match a lot of the other genre conventions, right? When you say cozy mystery, you know exactly what that is. You say mystery. When you say romance novel, you generally know exactly what it is. But sci-fi fantasy, you could be getting, Left Hand of Darkness, or you could be getting Conan. And like, who knows? And so a lot of sci-fi fantasy has this sort of perhaps overinflated sense of its own importance. And so gets really mad when the New York Times looks down on sci-fi fantasy. That's the kind of realm I was in college, right? My one of my professors was the poet laureate of Utah. And he and I, he was an excellent professor, by the way, taught me a lot, but we went the rounds on sci-fi fantasy because I was submitting The Way of Kings to his class, and he was saying, read more Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That's the sort of fantasy that you should be writing. And yeah, we didn't see eye to eye on that, and I kind of had a chip on my shoulder. And I sold a book halfway into my master's program, and so everybody got really intimidated. But I still have a bit of a chip on my shoulder, if you can't tell, about people who look down on other genres. Just because a genre is trying to do something different doesn't make it less literature.
Yeah,
I think we actually kind of had something tied a little bit to this this particular topic.
Yeah.
The idea of, and I mean, I know we're talking about essentially genre elitism, but there's also other aspects of fandoms that are fantastic, but some that aren't as fantastic. Are there certain ones that you're hoping go away? And then what are the things that you really love about it?
So I really love what the internet has done for fandom, right? Because I grew up in the Wheel of Time fandom, and in Usenet days, back in the ancient days, where fandom was internet fandom really started on Usenet, and was my freshman year at college, hanging out in the Tolkien forums on Usenet and things like that, arguing about whether the Balrog has wings or not. And I say yes, by the way. But it's this thing where it also has allowed us to be more elitist and more cliquish. And that really is something that whenever I'm asked to give a speech at a convention, I usually theme my speech around, hey, let's not be elitist. One thing that really bothered me was how the sci-fi fantasy community treated initially Harry Potter. I don't know if you know, but back in the early 2000s, there were a lot of people in the sci-fi fantasy community who were like, this is not true fantasy. How dare everyone read this thing instead of, say, Diane Duane's version of the kids in Magic School? It was way before this. And then, J.K. Rowling, who is known for sticking her foot in her mouth, to say the least, had a big old thing about how she doesn't write fantasy, that her books are too important to be fantasy. And if you ever want to have a fun time, read Terry Pratchett's editorial letter to the editor about J.K. Rowling and about how you get to you're a fantasy writer and stop being so elitist. But one of the things I really is when we as a community, we love things. That's what fandom's about. We want to share our love for something. And it really got bad with Aragon and Twilight, right? When people are discovering sci-fi fantasy for the first time as young people, and then are like suddenly joining these communities and then getting treated like a pariah because they don't like the right thing, right? And this really bothered me, and still bothers me that the communities can do this, can be like, it's like the first thing you do when you love something is want to share it, and the second thing is find something worse than it so you can be like, at least I'm not like those people, right? I wish we were more welcoming of people who are discovering stories for the first time. Aragon's a really good example of this, right? Like I discovered the boy and his dragon story through Anne McCaffrey. There was a girl and her dragon for the first two books, or the first one book, and then two were guys, and then there were girls again. Anyway, Anne McCaffrey is people get to have dragons. That's the thing. And then, other people discovered it with Aragon. And yes, it's a very similar story, but guess what? We all tell the same stories over and over again, just with our different own take on them. And so people being like, oh, Aragon's just a copy of Anne McCaffrey. No, it's not. It's a story told by someone who's passionate about telling stories. And a lot of people are discovering it and loving it. Great. They get to join and come into our club. So
I think you see this a lot when adaptations start getting made too, that then new people come to find it, and the people that have loved it for years kind of almost get defensive. Like, I've loved it for longer.
You can't join our club.
First, everyone's excited, and then they get cliquish.
I know we've mentioned Wheel of Time a couple times. It seems appropriate as it's about to come out. Just a blanket. Are you excited? Have you been excited? All of your thoughts on the show. Are you nervous about anything?
I'm not really nervous. I'm a producer on the show. And I've been working on it for years now. And so I know that it's good. I know that fans are going to respond very well to it. The showrunner and I only have one disagreement on things. Everything else that he's done, I'm totally on board with, and it's an amicable disagreement. I think he's done an excellent job, an almost impossible job. I don't know how general audiences will receive it, right? Wheel of Time is much like Dune in that these are foundational epics for the science fiction and fantasy community that have been copied so many times that the question is, does it even feel fresh anymore, right? Like Game of Thrones, when it came out in book form, was a response to the Wheel of Time, right? It was fantasy was going very high fantasy, lots of magic and things like that. And George and Jim, Robert Jordan, were friends. And George did this very gritty, rooted in reality, almost historical fiction, made fantasy as a response against that, right? And yet in the collective unconscious, Game of Thrones is first. So you got the response to Wheel of Time, and now the Wheel of Time's coming out. Is it going to feel like a response to Game of Thrones, or is it going to feel like it, belongs in an era before Game of Thrones? Who knows, right? That's too hard for me to separate my love of the series from. But I can say the adaptation is excellent. The acting is excellent. Rosamund Pike does just an amazing job. But all the cast is good. They are very well cast, and the adaptation is excellent. So I'm not worried. I think fans are gonna really like it. And we've already got a second season, and we're already working on that. So we at least know Amazon's going to support it that much. So
that's good.
Awesome.
We're all very excited to watch it.
Who's your favorite character, and why is it loyal?
Well, my favorite character was always Perrin growing up. And so I'm very happy to see Perrin working on screen. I really like the Perrin. And so, but yeah, I really like Loyal. He's great. Perrin was my man.
On a similar topic to favorite characters, these two over here are very curious to know your thoughts on this.
Oh yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. So I like to think of your Cosmere as kind of the fantasy book equivalent to the MCU. And I know a lot of people in the community kind of use that comparison when pitching the Cosmere. I've heard you talk about the MCU in previous interviews, but I don't know if I've ever heard you say who your favorite character was or which movie was your favorite. So I'd love to know.
Okay. So I could talk about this for hours, but I'll try to keep try to keep it short. I got really lucky in that I started writing the Cosmere like really leaning into it with Mistborn. If you don't know the story, Elantris was book number 6 of those 13. I had started dabbling in this idea for the Cosmere. When I sold Elantris, I then sold Mistborn, which is book number 14. I didn't want to publish any of the old novels. I'm like, I want to start fresh. And so I built the Cosmere writing Mistborn in 2004 to 2006 and retrofitted Elantris to fit into it. Is how the Cosmere started, as a shared universe of epic fantasies. This was considered daring at the time. My editor was really worried, right? And indeed, fans were really worried. When I released Elantris, and then the next book was not a direct sequel, but was another planet and things like that, the sales to Mistborn took a hit. And that the most dangerous point of my career was when Mistborn came out and underperformed in hardcover. And the publisher then printed a lot fewer copies of the second Mistborn book. And the books were but not doing well, except the paperback of Mistborn, then people picked up and loved. And so Mistborn 2, because they underprinted, went out of stock immediately. It sold out. And so suddenly the publisher's like, oh, it's okay. And we kind of clawed out of that death spiral with the paperback of Mistborn. But the conventional wisdom of release a sequel because it will get everyone who read the first one to read it, it is a real thing. And then when I refused to write more Mistborn, the publisher was really kind of mad at me. When I released Warbreaker instead, he's like, "What are you doing? You're doing this again?" And so it was this thing where the publisher was, very unhappy with some of these decisions. But I got really lucky in that the MCU started coming out, 2007, I believe, and I released Mistborn in 2006, right? And so by the time the MCU was really becoming a thing, the Cosmere was becoming a thing, and people were like, I was able to be like, it's like that, kind of. And I think this was coming. This is, like I said, I could talk about this forever, but I think this is coming. The internet fandom that we talked about allows us to do these things in a way we couldn't before. If you read The Wheel of Time, one of the things you might find annoying now is that every book has basically a catch you up on all the characters summary at the beginning hidden as part of the narrative. So the opening chapters of a lot of the Wheel of Time books, particularly early ones, have a lot of reminders of who everyone is, what they're doing, and why they're there. Because we didn't have the internet in a usable mass market form in the early 90s when these books were coming out. And so Robert Jordan, what you did back then is just work in a summary as you were writing. And, having this big shared continuity was just too much to ask. Of people who couldn't go to an easy place and get the Cliff Notes version of what happened in the book that they read or that they missed or things like that. But once this started to become a thing, and once you're like, oh, I forgot who this character is, and then you can snap your fingers and be reminded, suddenly we were ready for more complex stories that work and interlock in really interesting ways. And so I think it was coming. I just got lucky to be the person who was trying this when the technology was there and when there was a really big example of it being successful. So I do love the MCU. It is one of my favorite things that's ever come into existence. My favorite MCU films are mostly Avengers films. And I'm gonna set those aside, right? Okay. That's not the real answer. Everybody, everybody loves Infinity War and Endgame, right? They're awesome. And the original Avengers is a really great movie. If I have to pick one, though, I'm going to pick Doctor Strange.
Jess,
you guessed it right, Jess.
I felt
a couple of reasons. Well, I'll pick it. Number one, the visuals. Number two, it's magic, right? I mean, come on, give me a wizard. Benedict Cumberbatch does an excellent job as Doctor Strange. He has the look down, and he just works really well. I like the supporting cast a ton in Doctor Strange, and just the whole movie works for me on this just beautiful level that I love. I watched the movie and I'm like, wow, people could actually make one of my books into a film now. The technology exists that we could do this.
We're waiting.
Watching that film was one of the first times I ever really thought that.
What a perfect segue.
I was going to say, though, that was a really good comment about how the fandom culture and just how we've built the internet and the connectedness for everyone, how that allows for more complexity. And I think that's one of the really fun things about the MCU and now the Cosmere is connecting all the Easter eggs. When you're putting Easter eggs in your books, are you trying to, how do you plan on planting an Easter egg in a book? Do you do that ahead of time, or do you kind of find, once the story is complete, do you kind of find spots?
So most of it happens in between those 2 points.
Okay.
Most of it happens while I'm writing. And I'll say, I need some sort of element here. And instead of then just I need a character. I need a character here. Instead of just wholesale creating someone new, which normally you do, but once in a while I'm like, this person from an upcoming book would slot in really well here. She would be in this scene. She would be here because of these reasons. Let's put her in this scene. And then later on, that foreshadowing is there. Same with kind of little Cosmere elements. It didn't start that way, though. The Cosmere, if you haven't heard, it started that I really like big, complex epics. And I wanted to do something like that. But early when I was trying to break in, despite the fact that when publishers get a book, they want a sequel, from a new author, they don't want to see a sequel. Like they want to see a first book, right? And I was writing these 13 novels, and I realized if a publisher doesn't buy, I write book number 1, send it out, nobody wants it. If my second book is book number 2 in that series, I can't send it anywhere, right? And so I got in the habit of writing a new world, a new setting, and a new story with every book. And I really like that, but I love big epics. So I started telling this story behind the scenes to connect all of these as kind of a way to let me have my cake and eat it too, right? And so when I broke in, I started doing this kind of naturally. And the origins of this, the roots of this, you'll find this really interesting if you haven't heard before. The roots of this are when I was reading books as a teenager, I did this thing. I don't know if other people do this, where I would tell the story in my head of side characters. The main character's story had been told, right? But when I would lay down to go to bed that night, I'd be like, oh, these 2 side characters that Anne McCaffrey mentioned, who are they? What's their story? She's not telling that story, so I can in my head. And I invented these characters who went between all the worlds and were secretly doing stuff to connect Anne McCaffrey and Melanie Ron and Barbara Hamley's books, which are the ones I was reading at the time, right? And so that's where Hoid, the main guy who moves between the worlds, began. He began as a side character in an Anne McCaffrey novel in the back of my head that I was imagining. And so when I started, when I sold and I wanted to do this for real, I started building his story behind the scenes as something that eventually I would tell, but it was really subtle Easter eggs. Like if you look for Hoid in the original Mistborn novels, 2 of the 3 books he's mentioned by name, but only in one of them does he even speak. And the other one, you only have ramifications of what he's done. He's not even, and so it's like it's this hard thing. I guess he does speak in the second book. Never mind, he does speak, but he's only mentioned by name in 2 of the 3 books. And the third one, he doesn't even have a speaking role. It's really just a line here that's whatever. And then fans just latched onto it because, like I said, the MCU is happening. People are ready for this complexity. People really wanted this and hadn't been given it, and so they just jumped on hardcore. And I'm like, oh, I don't have to be as coy with this. And so you can watch my experiences with it. Like when I was writing Warbreaker was when Mistborn was out, right? When I was editing Warbreakers, when Mistborn 2 was out, and people were already starting to kind of pick it out. And by the time I released Warbreaker, people were asking me, who's this Hoid guy? And you can see his part in Warbreaker is increased just a little bit. Then Way of Kings, he becomes a main character, right? Because by then I knew people really liked this and they were jumping on board. And so by then, the gloves were off and, everything was fair game. And so the more I've written, the more I've leaned into it.
I loved when it wasn't quite as popular, the concept of BookTube, when people would be talking about Hoid spottings, and it used to actually be really exciting to be like, was that Hoid right there? And now you just look it up and it's all listed here all the times Hoid's appeared.
Yeah,
I love Hoid spottings. I know that Skyward, you said, is not connected to the Cosmere, but we did have a really fun fan question that somebody had that sort of relates to this this topic. I'll let Jess take this one.
Oh yeah, I love this question. So if you had to take the characters from Skyward and merge them into any of your another world of yours, where would they best fit? And where would you like them to explore, I guess?
Yeah, so I think that if we pluck, so one of the things I'm kind of pushing Spensa to do, and we can actually talk about Cytonic without giving too many spoilers. It's hard to talk about book 3 of a series, right? But in Cytonic, Spensa's becoming more of an explorer. This has been my theme for her. In book 1, she realizes being a soldier, it's still part of her, but it leaves something lacking. It's not as glamorous as she imagined it. And in book 2, she finds a much larger universe than she expected. Book 3 is about her kind of leaning into the curious side of her and learning about places and people and things like that. Where in book 2, it almost had she had a confrontational relationship with this discovery that the world was the universe is a bigger place. She didn't want it to be bigger. She wanted it to be simple. So now she's leaning into that. So I think she'd be a very nice match as a world hopper in the Cosmere. Pull her out and let her start going to all these places. I actually last night I signed Cytonic for our release party. We take pre-orders and things like that. And one of the things people can do is they can pay some money to charity and have me write whatever they would like in their book. Normally they just get a signed book, but if they kick in a few bucks to charity, I'll answer a question or write something in a book. And one person said, all right, write me a conversation between Lift from the Cosmere and Spensa from Skyward. So there's a little 4-line in their book of Spensa and Lift of conversing. That sort of thing is fun to do. Years ago, Random House was doing this sort of cage match thing where they would pit different characters from different books against each other and ask the authors if they had any opinions. And some authors did some write-ups. George did one, George Martin, and I did one. And mine was a conversation with between Kelsier and Moiraine, right? I do enjoy that fan side of things. The what ifs are fun.
Yeah, I would love if they made. I mean, we all want adaptations of your works, of course, but now it makes me want there to be a fighting game similar to something like and have all the different characters.
Yeah, Smash Brothers except Cosmere.
Yes, exactly. That would be amazing. I would love that. I know we've been doing a reread for some of us here of your Skyward series, and someone actually mentioned in a reading sprint that we were doing that they thought Spensa and Lift would get along. So that's really interesting that someone else had that feeling too. On the topic of adaptations, I've always wondered, do you personally see some of your works as video games, some as movies, some as TV shows, and how would you want them to be? What style could you kind of point at, like this thing and this thing combined?
Yeah, good question. So I've always seen Mistborn as a feature film. I know that a lot of people, we're in a renaissance with this premium cable of the kind of the mini series. I have Mistborn's plot to me as a heist story, becoming an epic. It's just I based it off of a lot of my favorite heist movies, and I've always envisioned it as a feature film. The rest are tough sells as feature films. Even Skyward, probably is better off as a series. Just book to film is tough. It's really tough. I really loved the new Dune adaptation. I thought it was excellent. But even that, you can't do the whole book. You have to do half the book and leave the biggest complaint being that it feels like half of a story. And that's the only way to do it justice, right? And so I agree that most of my books would probably make better television shows than films. And that's expressly true with the Stormlight Archive. We tried, the people I'm partnered with tried just to see, hired out a script, and I came back and it was for a 4-hour-long movie, and that's as short as they could get it. We're yeah, that's about what we expected.
I'd watch it though.
No, that's what Dune's going to be. It's a 4-hour-long movie, 5-hour probably, single movie. But you've got that problem if you make it into 2 movies and split it at an unsatisfying point, then you may not get your second movie, right? And so it's rough. Video games are a different thing in that I don't think that I would adapt any of my books straight up as a video game. I love gaming. I'm an avid gamer. And I have seen very few successful book to video game straight adaptations. The best ones tend to be, all right, here's the setting. Here's some of these characters and lore. Let's write something that works as a video game first. And then you get your Shadow of Mordors and things like that, which really work much better. And I feel like a straight adaptation is a tough sell to me. I would love to do an open world RPG based on the Cosmere. If I had an infinite budget, it's like, all right, Elder Scrolls, but Roshar, and that's what I would make.
It'd be amazing.
But that's a very tough sell in today's market. Even the Elder Scrolls are a tough sell. The video game industry is another one of those weird things that we don't have time to talk about. We could talk about for a long time.
We definitely could. Kind of similar, not exactly the same, but in relation to books in general and what you tend to read outside.
So I tend to read sci-fi fantasy. I just do. A lot of YA, a lot of adult sci-fi fantasy. If I'm not reading that, I'm probably reading nonfiction. But I mean, I'm just a sci-fi fantasy fanboy, right? Like this is, and I still love it. And so if I'm gonna read for pleasure, I'm probably going to pick up a Pratchett book, most likely, or whatever thing is big right now that I feel like I should know about, right? Whatever is really big. And that's just useful to know. The truth is, though, almost all of my reading time is spent reading my friends' books or cover blurbs for new authors who need a boost, right? And so that's just like almost all of my reading time. And that's all sci-fi fantasy. So
yeah. Have you read any new release this year, sci-fi or fantasy that?
Boy, what have I read this year? I just finished Brian McClellan's new book, which I think comes out next year. He's a former student of mine, so it's cheating to promote Brian, but Brian's really good. And I really enjoy reading his books. That's the most recent book I read. So we'll just do that. It's not YA. It's epic fantasy.
Gotcha.
But yeah.
Yeah. So kind of similar, but not. So I know you just said you're a sci-fi fantasy fanboy, but would you ever consider writing outside of that, or you want to stick with sci-fi and fantasy primarily?
I have dabbled, and it always turns into sci-fi fantasy. Right? Like I always add a magic system. Right? Like what I love to do is explore the what ifs that are impossible in our universe. And so I don't know. I don't see myself ever, I don't have wanderlust. Sci-fi fantasy is such an enormous umbrella, right? Like when I tried to write detective stories, they turned into sci-fi fantasy. Right? They turned into Michael Crichton style investigating new technologies and things like that. So, I just don't see myself. I know what I like. I know what I like to write. Maybe a nonfiction. I could see doing the most likely thing you would see for me that's not sci-fi fantasy would be a how to write sci-fi fantasy.
Very nice.
Or your autobiography, maybe.
Yes, or my autobiography, which would be so boring. Because it would be like,
that would be so interesting. I would love
I'm
that.
sitting and writing again.
Now I'm writing in Hawaii.
Would you narrate the audiobook?
Yeah, I have a very healthy family life, and we all get along.
We'd read it.
So back to Skyward, we, especially in the second book, get introduced to quite a few different alien species, and some of them are very different from humans. So I was wondering, what were your inspirations behind writing them?
So one of the things that is fun to do in sci-fi fantasy is imagine different kinds of life, right? And how would they exist? How would they think? How would they talk? That's like, it's one of the origins of sci-fi fantasy is asking that what if. I find that a lot of fun. And I like aliens whose biology influences their culture. That's just one of my favorite things to write about. And I also like to, in a book series, like I grew up on Star Trek, right? Next Generation. And Next Generation, because of budget constraints, their aliens are almost exclusively, here, we put a thing on their nose. Now they're an alien. because, that's the budget they could have. A book doesn't have that budget. A book has an unlimited budget. It has you can do whatever you want to do with your special effects. So why not make a species that is a sapient smell and things like that? And why not explore a race of people who can pre-generate a child with a personality, let them live for a while, and then determine if they want to have that child. These are the sorts of things we can ask in sci-fi fantasy that other stories can't ask. And I think we do, responsibility is the wrong term, but I do think that there is an aspect to writing sci-fi fantasy that that allows us to explore these things about the existence and the human condition, that it's good for us to lean into, to be asking these questions, because that's where sci-fi fantasy does get into some of its more, I don't want to say useful, because I think every piece of writing is useful, but it's more unique things that it can do to be of use to the reader. I always say that the best part about books, the thing that books do, is it lets you see through someone else's eyes. And books are empathy machines, right? They teach you to see when they're working right, the world through the eyes of someone very different from you, and understand their life and their perspective. And that's one of the things I just love about fiction. And a book that does that really well is a great masterwork of literature, in my opinion, because that's one of the key purposes. But ideas are really important too. And a lot of fiction is about this idea or that idea. What would we do if this happened? And alien species that are like this are ways for us to explore this. And to talk about it more, I would probably get too self-important. So we'll leave it.
Well, we're interested in anything.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, a mark of a great novel to me is an amazing AI. So, like, how did you get in the mindset? Like, how did you research to write Mbot? Because I love his sass. Or it's there.
Characters, including Mbot as an AI, are the thing that I don't plan as much in my books. So I am famously an outliner. I like to have a really strong outline for a book. I think that if you don't have a strong outline, it's much harder to pull off a spectacular ending of the style I like to. You can definitely have great endings without an outline, but the style I write, an ending, or having the ending in mind, really helps. Helps you build a character theme to match with the plot and things like that. But I found that if I plan my characters too much, they feel cardboard or wooden. And this means that I have this weird push and pull with my outlines, where I come up with the type of story I want to write. I do a bunch of the world building. And then I often have to sit down and try a character multiple times until I find a voice for them that works. You can see this actually in Skyward, where we're putting in my first 3 attempts at Spensa to the collection of the novellas we're doing. So if you're not familiar, Skyward, with a co-author friend of mine, we wrote 3 novellas that are kind of companion pieces to Cytonic. So if people haven't read those, go check them out.
They're great. I've read the
first
first
one's called Sunreach. And we're doing a collection of those next year. And in that, as a bonus material, we're putting the first 3 attempts at Spensa because it was the 4th one that I landed on that became who I wanted her to be and how I wanted the book to start. And that's very common for me. Basically, it's like casting different actors in a role until I find the one that works. And I do that with most of my characters. And then I go back to my outline and I rebuild my outline. And as I'm writing the book, there's always this kind of push and pull where if the character is becoming someone different than the outline can accommodate, I have to rebuild the outline to match who this character is becoming and things like that. So for Mbot, I am often looking for, with characters, pairings that just work. Pairings where the characters can talk about anything and it will be fun to read. And so if they talk about the plot, hopefully it'll be even more fun to read, right? And so you need people who play off of each other in interesting ways. And so a lot of Mbot's development was developed as somebody to play off of Spensa, who I'd already designed. And that was a very natural, organic sort of thing. I don't do specific research into how AI works in order to make a character like this. There are things that I will do a lot of research on, usually surrounding mental health or neurodivergence or things like that, to make sure that I'm doing an accurate representation rather than a Hollywood representation. But when it comes to a character's personality, I'm not as worried about that.
It's funny that you describe your approach to writing MBOT that way, when MBOT, or at least they consider themselves to be very practical and programmed,
Yes.
and they can
Yes.
only do these things.
Yeah.
Yet he's organic in his origin. So I actually wanted to ask, and you kind of touched on this just now, but how do you approach writing characters that are so different from you?
Yeah.
And then are there any aspects to characters? I think that's something a lot of writers wonder, am I the person to write this character? And so I'm wondering if there's any lines that you don't feel comfortable crossing, and how do you in general create those characters that are so different?
So the lines that I wouldn't be comfortable crossing, let's go there. Number one, I try to stay away from accurate depictions that are still harmful, right? There are books that can delve into this very well. But, like looking at the mind of someone who is deeply racist and doing a whole story about that, is maybe not something that I want to dig into. The other thing that I try to be careful of is I feel like as an author, I have more room in a book that is a large ensemble piece to delve into characters who are very different from myself, particularly in ways like that, the sort of own voices thing, right? Like if I'm writing a book like the Stormlight Archive, and I write in an LGBTQ character where I am a straight cis male, as part of an ensemble, that feels like the thing I should be doing, right? Like representing the entire world the best I can feels like the right thing to be. It feels like a moral good. Writing a specific book only about what it's like to grow up as a gay teen and the issues you face, not something that I am currently comfortable doing. If that makes sense, like that line right there, it is where I've landed for all kinds of things. And so like I will deal with characters dealing with prejudice in my books. One thing sci-fi fantasy I think is very good at doing. A lot of my stories are dealing with prejudice and racism in many ways. But writing a story about what it's like to be a young Black man growing up in the 70s in America and dealing, with the issues with the civil rights movement having been successful, maybe not my place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of
so
sense.
that's where I kind of draw that line. I think everyone's line is going to be different, but those are kind of two things that I'm not that right now. I kind of have that buffer, if that makes sense. How I do research, though, one of the things that I do like to do a lot is neurodivergence. And this is because I find that the older I get, the more people I get to know, the more I realize that even the term neurodivergence is kind of a misnomer, in that there is nothing to diverge from. There is no normal. Right? That every human being has a different psychological makeup. And some of those things impede our living the life that we want to. And that's the whole purpose of mental health and things like this, is to help you in those regards. And I'm not trying to trivialize the fact that certain people do have enormous issues that make it difficult for them to live their life. But at the same time, I don't know if there is a neurotypical. We just pretend there is. And part of, I think the problem is that fiction has created this fake neurotypical individual that is presented as normal to the world. And then you compare yourself to this and be like, wow, I could never be a hero in one of these stories because I don't have this fake non-existent neurotypicalness. How many people in the world suffer from depression? It's a large number of people, and we pretend that that's the neurodivergence. And so I feel as a responsibility as an author to make sure that I am filling out my cast with people who are experiencing different ways of seeing the world, different difficulties with their mental health, and are working on those in positive ways. And it's just kind of a thing that I think is really important. And so it's something that I do feel comfortable with. I have I've done a lot of research into it. I have a lot of really good beta readers who help me out. I've read a lot of primary accounts, and I do think you have to be really responsible, because you can look at some of my earlier works trying to do this and see me doing it poorly. And you just kind of ease into, you have to find your way through things being a writer. But it is something that's important to me.
I think
it's important to so many of us. So we really appreciate how much effort you put into that. This is a little less, I think, heavy.
I do need to go. I have another interview right now. We're 3 minutes past it. My assistant just knocked on the door. So do you want to cut that part out and have me and do an outro?
Well, we'll just, this is, what, this is natural. And this is
our outro.
Common. This is real life,
Thank
right?
you.
So, thank you so much.
We'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thanks. Bye.